Namaste. Welcome to the Speaker's Yoga Diary, Volume 3. Today, the speaker would like to talk about two kinds of seeing. There are two kinds of seeing. Seeing the objects and things with language, and seeing the objects and things without language. Let's first take the first kind of seeing, the objects and things in nature with language. We always look at things and objects with the help of language. The language acts as a medium here. Without language, it's impossible for us to see the things and objects, because we have been trained right from school how to look at things and objects. And the moment we look at a thing or an object, we immediately question, what is it? What is the name of this thing or an object? How is this made of? How does it function? And so on. Therefore, in this act of seeing with the help of language, we gain knowledge. It is purely intellectual. This seeing is intellectual, because we use the intellect to question, what is it? And therefore it results in knowledge. This way we have gained more and more knowledge. There is also another aspect of this seeing. As it results in knowledge, we also gain more and more self. The self gains more prominence in this act of seeing. Along with the knowledge. But this knowledge also corrupts the act of seeing and the seen. Therefore, in this act of seeing, with the help of language, which results in tremendous knowledge, corrupts our thinking. We accumulate more and more self. We become more and more selfish and self-centric. The speaker is not denying this kind of knowledge. It has its own utility. Apart from this act of seeing with the help of language, do we have another act of seeing? Yes, the speaker says. And this act of seeing is seeing the object and thing without the help of language. There is no language. The language will not come and intervene in the act of seeing. This act of seeing without language is a beautiful act of seeing, because there is no intervention of language. and it is seeing without language. There is no language here. You just see an object and thing as it is, without questioning. Therefore, in this act of seeing, nothing transpires between you and the object that is seen. What happens in that state is only a transmission of feeling in absolute silence. What remains there between you and the object is only a silence, and in that silence you transmit your feelings to the object, and the object in turn reflects its own feelings to the seer, that is you. But this entire process takes place in deep silence, and it is blissful. It is innocent and pure because there is no language here. The language taints the act of seeing. The moment you bring the language, then the self is formed. The intellect is brought here because you tend to question what is it, and therefore the intellect comes into being. But in this second act of seeing, there is no room for language. It is an act of seeing without the help of language. It is simply seeing the object as it is. So this act of seeing without language does not bring the self in us. There is no room for self. It is a selfless seeing, whereas the first act of seeing is a seeing with language. Therefore, the self, the presence of self is there. So the first act of seeing with the help of language enhances the self in us. The self grows and grows. We become more and more self-centric and self-conscious. Whereas in the second act of seeing, that is the seeing without language, there is no self. Because there is no language. What is there between you and the object is only the silence, and there is no self. So the first act of seeing results in the development of self. The second act of seeing without language is a losing of self. In the second act of seeing, we lose ourself. In the first act of seeing, we gain ourself. We acquire more and more self. We become more and more self-centric and self-conscious. So these are the two acts of seeing. The first act of seeing is seeing with language. That results in the phenomenal increase of knowledge and the self. The second act of seeing is seeing without language. And in this act of seeing, there is no self. In this act of seeing, we lose ourself. We become selfless. The first act of seeing is material and intellectual, whereas the second act of seeing is spiritual. Because there is no language, it is an act of pure seeing. There is no self in this act. The speaker is not dismissing the first act of seeing with the help of language, because it has resulted in phenomenal increase of knowledge, and that knowledge is essential for our survival because we use that knowledge as a means to survive in this world. We need that knowledge, which comes out of the act of seeing with or through the help of language. But there is also another act of seeing that we need to develop. But this act of seeing without language must happen naturally. And this can happen only when you are alone, not in the company of others. Because the others will intervene and disturb. Therefore, you lose that act of seeing without language. It is a selfless seeing. You can have that kind of selfless seeing only when you are alone. And when you are alone, it happens naturally. The act of seeing without language must happen naturally, and such an act of seeing without self is beautiful, pure, innocent, divine. And we need to cultivate this act of seeing also. We need to strike a balance between these two acts of seeing. The one act of seeing resulting in knowledge, another act of seeing losing the self. And we need to bring a kind of harmony between these two acts of seeing. As we strike the harmony between these two acts of seeing, it is called yoga. Yoga is bringing harmony between these two acts of seeing. You bridge the gap between these two acts of seeing. But we are more habituated to the first act of seeing, that is seeing with the help of language. We have never experienced the second act of seeing. We have never realized that there is another act of seeing. That act of seeing is without language. In that act of seeing without language, we lose ourselves. And this is what we need to develop and strike a balance between these two. Namaste.